Hi, this is Shondell Joyce, and I'm going to give you a sneak peek at my creative process in painting magical bubbles. First off, I always start off with a value sketch using the rule of thirds. By sketching with the rule of thirds, I figure out where the figure of the little boy needs to be and some of the bubbles. Then I make a color study to help me lay out my palette. This is the original reference photo, which I'm including as an inset in this demonstration. Once I have sketched the same composition onto my surface, which is an ampersand pastel board, then you can see the rule of thirds on the board. Then I am ready to start painting. In this case, I'm evaluating the reference photo and deciding whether to work from the back to the front or from dark to light. Because there's not a whole lot of overlapping, I'm going to go from dark to light. So I'm negative space painting the background around the figure. Right now, I'm using a dark forest green, which has a little bit of blue in it, so that pushes it towards the background. Because cool colors recede, warm colors come forward. So I'm enriching the bottom part with this deep chocolate brown to create a little warm in the bottom and help it to come forward. While I have that pastel in my hand, I use it in every spot that I feel it needs. So I'm putting some on the figure, putting some in the foreground. This will also help warm the figure up and bring it forward. This pastel is a harder pastel, so it's one of the first layers. Most darks in pastel are generally hard because the pigments are minerals derived from carbon. So they're pretty hard as it is. Lighter colors can be softer. Now I'm moving in with another color. In this case, it's pure black, and I'm putting some dark on the figure just to make the figure stand out. And then I'm covering the figure with some blue. That's a little more of a blue green in this case. Got a little bit of green for the green reflecting all around it. While I have it in my hand, I'm going to use it in various places to push back some elements of the surrounding landscape. Because the landscape is not clear, I want to have it as a lost edge. I'm making it look like a garden or forest area and don't want it to be too clear or detailed. Don't want it to compete with the figure or the bubbles, which have to go on last. So I'm doing the underpainting. This is a dry underpainting, and the bubbles will go right on top of it. I'm happy with the center part, and now I'm warming up some of the foliage with this yellow green in the foreground, and this will help make some texture differences in the greenery. You never want to use just a straight green for gardens. The places where the sun hits are going to be warmer. Places in shadow are going to be cooler, so I always want to use my greens based on color temperature. So I'm working a little bit of warm green, a little sunlight into the foreground and surrounding this cute little child with greenery, especially golden green. This particular pastel is a Mount Vision pastel, very soft. It's one of their larger sidewalk chalk style pastels, which I absolutely love because you can't be perfectionistic when you're painting with something that big, and it helps me to remember to be loose and painterly, which is always my goal, loose and painterly. This is a more refined green. It's a green gold, but it's in the cool range. So I'm using it to be something that's a little bit further behind and to give some distinction to the thin lines of the foliage and the stems of the flowers and so forth. It has a sharper edge than the larger pastel, so I can get thinner lines with it. I reposition it for a better reach. And I'm using mostly greens and reds. This is a complementary palette painting. You'll have to excuse me. I suffer from seasonal allergies and am in the midst of a major attack. Now, starting with the reds, I'm using what is similar to a rose madder, and this is a muted red. It's a wonderful skin tone, and I'm using it as a shadow skin tone on the child. The child is backlit, facing away from the light, so most of the skin tones are going to be shadowy colors. This is also a lovely red to incorporate in the other places in the around the figure as well. I'm negative space painting right up close to the figure just to keep my edges hard. The figure is all of the found edges. The landscape behind the figure and in front is all going to be lost edges with just a few defining flowers. So I'm using some of the dark to create some texture back there and to set the stage for when I put the flower heads on. It's very helpful to use something from the background to give you a sharp edge against the figure. Touching it just a bit here and there. The touching helps to break up the pastel, push it into the tooth, and open up the tooth for the flower heads for big pops of color that will be coming soon. There's a little bit of that peachy color again, the pink of the skin tone, the shadow skin tone. And now I'm working it into a few other places in the composition. You never want to have one color in a small place in the painting because it acts like an eye magnet and will trap your eye right in that specific area. So I find other places to create color harmony. Now, in looking at the reference photo, you might think, well, Sean, where on earth do you see red and green as the complementary palettes in this painting? And with reference photos, you never have to be true to the photo. And if I were true to the photo, it would probably be more yellow-purple than red and green. But I wanted something warmer and to use more reds than I would oranges or yellows. So I opted to push it towards the red and green, and the only orange I will use is the one I'm using right now, which is a reddish orange. So this reddish orange color is a wonderful warm that helps to break up the figure, put a little in the hair, and gives you an idea of garden poppies, red flowers. Now, when you use a complementary palette, you can use warmer and cooler versions of the same colors. So a cooler version of that warm red would be red violet. A warmer version is what I'm using right now to put in the little shots of color. Now I'm using some red violet. This is more of a shadow color. It's a light lavender version of red violet. It's going to be some of the flowers that are in the background. So these are ones that are a little more shady. I'm using some of it on the figure as well. There's some warmer and cooler areas on the figure and working it into the composition. Just finding a place here and there. Never want to put just a pop. I also don't want to cover the whole thing. Now I'm using a hard new pastel to help define some of the edges on the figure. This makes the figure a little more believable. And then some light, cool green color for the color on the t-shirt facing away from the sun. It's a shadow color. Also working that color, it's a good cool for shadowy whites. So I'm putting a few white flowers here and there in the shadows. Touch just to soften edges. Open up tooth. And now for some warmer skin tones. This is where the light is hitting the cute little child's face. And I'm more clearly defining some edges on the cheeks. Sometimes I have to pull in a pencil to define features that are this small. Usually when I paint a figure this small, I try not to put in features and fingers because it's too much detail. So here's a little bit of light. Now this shows the backlighting. So the light is hitting the back of this cute little boy. So I am lighting the edge of the figure's hair, and just showing that the child is surrounded by this beautiful sunlit area. This will be important with the bubbles because as I start to put in the bubbles, I want them to pop as if the sun is hitting them as well. Some of the flowers in the foreground are big heads of Queen Anne's lace, which I don't want to have that much detail on. I want them to be abstract shapes. So I'm just making them larger, bigger shapes, warmer and lighter colored. These are light pink. And you get a feel that these flowers are closer to the viewer and further from the figure. And you're peeking through these flowers to get a good look at the figure in the garden. So this is the foreground. I'm softening the edges on these flowers to make sure that they are lost. I want to keep, this is a middle ground focused painting. So I want to keep all of your attention in the middle ground. Now, just a few found edges towards the middle ground, a few bits of green, warm green. And that helps to pull your gaze right in. If you enjoyed watching me paint this cute little fella blowing bubbles, please consider joining one of my Wednesday night pastel classes. These are live on Zoom. You get to ask questions, get feedback, and participate in the class the whole time. And there are several other people as well. Classes are always small, but big enough that you get a broad range of experience, small enough that you get a lot of individual attention. Now I'm using a template to make bubbles. So the template is a pen lid that I rubbed onto a pastel stick and then use it to make little circles. It leaves just a slight chalky little circle, which is a perfect little template for me to fill in later. Now I'm using a small broken piece of pastel that I push and twist, and that creates a small circle too. And this is the butt end of a pencil that I rub pastel on, and it gives me tiny little bubbles. So there's many different ways you can make bubbles. Here I'm tracing around a pastel stick, which makes a smaller bubble, or more of a medium-sized bubble. But you don't want to overdo it, because you can have too many bubbles. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. If they're all over, then they're nowhere. So I want to have maybe a handful of bubbles, make it look more realistic and playful, and put one in the child's hand. I'm using a wooden ruler as a mole stick to keep my hand from smearing the pastel as I go on top of some of the tighter areas to flesh out the bubbles. I'm using a white pastel pencil and putting 2 white edges on each bubble. This helps to see clearly the top and the bottom of each bubble. And then I'll put some color towards the center of each bubble as well. Now I've got a pretty good crop of bubbles around our little figure. You know, I chose not to make some of the bigger ones that you see in the reference photo because they distract from the photo. They're very unreal looking. And some things in a photo, which is a moment of life, a snapshot of reality, don't look real in a painting. So you have to learn to discern what's going to work for you and what isn't. I'm using some blue, putting a little blue in the center of these rounded shapes. Now, a dark in the center helps to create a rounded form. I know it's counterintuitive because we know bubbles are clear, but they're actually reflecting a lot of the light that's around them. And in the roundest part of the bubble, it's going to show you some darks. So having some darks helps to give some shape and form to those bubbles. I'm also reflecting a lot of colors from the garden and from the child and the child's clothing in the bubbles as well. A slight touch and pulling some of the light green from the child's clothing as a highlight to the bubbles. I hardly use pure white or pure black, and instead often look for color temperature. Like, is it a warmer light or a cooler light? Is it a warmer dark or a cooler dark? I always try to think of a color in terms of temperature and value more than the color itself. It doesn't really matter what color you use. If it's the correct temperature and value, it'll be believable. Putting a few highlights. These are warm little dots of light on the bubbles in the direction of the sun. And this helps to create the sense that the sun is behind the child, is lighting all the bubbles in the same spot. Some of the bubbles I touch and twist my finger, and that blends all of the color together and makes them look very circular. I'm also putting some highlights on the big flowers in the foreground since they're facing the same direction. All right, now it's time for a few finishing touches on the figure. I'm putting just a couple of shadowy skin tones and a touch here and there, working it through the composition. And the painting is 98% done at this point. So just a few touches and I am calling it a day. Please consider joining me on Wednesday nights. The details are on my website under online classes. The website is Shondell Joyce at shondelljoyce.com, and you can see all the upcoming online pastel classes. And I hope to meet you.